Victoria 3 is a very different game from its predecessors. It's different from Victoria 2, but it's also different from Hearts of Iron 3, Crusader Kings 3 and any other Paradox game really. There's something about it that might make it the best grand strategy game made by Paradox, regardless of all the criticism. And for the time I have been playing it, I've been trying to put my finger on what makes it so special. I think some of it has to do with the fact that the previous Paradox games would inevitably end up depending too much on mana, an abstract resource that allows players to enact different laws and make other decisions. The worst offender in the Paradox series of games is the recent Imperator, which almost relies entirely on that. The reason why the mana system doesn't work is that it takes out the player out of the game world and reminds them that they're playing a glorified board game with arbitrary points. But Victoria 3 does something different. Watching a fellow YouTuber's video, I realized it's not just a board game ported into personal computer, but rather it's a simulation. While mana points do exist in the game, the main resources, determinants of what the player can do and how powerful their country is, are demographics. Each individual person brings something to the country, and there are millions of them. That's how Victoria 3 graduates from a board game into an actual historical simulation. It humanizes the processes that we know as politics, and does it in a way that makes sense and feels satisfying. It's a mix of history, anthropology, political sciences, and economics. It's sometimes counterintuitive. Money is not something to hoard and spend, but something to consider. Population is an opportunity, but most importantly, your country is governed not just by you, but by our populace. Interest groups are the key to the internal politics engine. The game surprised me multiple times on how well it is able to simulate history and the conflicts between the interest groups within the country, the progress against conservatism, the city against the village, war against peace. And I want to talk more about how well does this game map onto our actual history and what could it do better. Some quick notes from the editing room. Number 1, voice quality can be all over the place because this was being worked on for half a year. Number 2, the video is an essay on the feature and how it is implemented and what could be made better. Number 3, it is not meant as a criticism. Paradox developers know their vision, priorities and the engine capabilities best. I'm just kind of exploring the topic. Comments and constructive criticism is always welcome. See you in the comment section and please enjoy the video. In Victoria 3, the internal politics are fueled by various interest groups that represent the cumulative power of both wealth and numbers, of people who stand united by capital, profession, or religion. Landowners represent the aristocrats, or, literally the people owning the land, while the rural folk reflect the will of the masses making their living outside of urban centers, and so on. When learning history in schools, we are usually left with the idea that each country is led by, usually, a singular ruler or maybe an interest group that can enact their will unopposed the way that they want to. And usually, somehow that will coincides with this strange concept of what is best for the country. This simple understanding ignores the fact that underneath the country there are always different groups of people that have different goals and needs. It is hard for a single person to embody this singular will, and that's why you will rarely have a president in any democratic country that has popularity over 60%. And if that does happen, it's either because the president is powerless, or the opposite, he's a dictator. Or maybe there's a war going on that makes everyone feel more united under them. But of course, there's more to it. Countries are not simple organisms, but rather, as one book puts it, organizations of organizations. And that is what Victoria 3 tries to simulate with its interest groups. Each interest group represents a certain segment of the population and attempts to support or oppose laws that are helpful or harmful to their interests. And of course, as in real life, there is no single group that represents the national will, as there is no single group that could do that in real life too. Interest groups shape the politics of the country and define how much freedom does the player have in enacting different laws. They can initiate their own movements to pass laws actively, but they can also lend their support to laws that the player wants to pass, as long as they are in the government. The opposite is true as well. If the governing interest group does not want feminism, there's no way for the player to enact it. they will need to wait for one to pop up and make sure they manage to muster enough support to get them into power. An interest group will support is predefined, but it can change in time. The aristocrats might become the elite if the country becomes more democratic, and leaders can bring their own ideas to the table. It is not uncommon to see an abolitionist aristocrat profoundly shift the way the country is going just because of their own personal opinion. As a result, the player is forced to interact with the interest groups, and more widely speaking, with the population of its country in a much more profound way than in other games, and that creates ample opportunities for different ways for every country to change and develop. As it is, the system forces the player to consider the population of their country to be a living and breathing organism that they must take note of. It also gives a human side to processes within countries that are mechanical in other grand strategy games. Passing a law is not merely a button click, it's a difficult process that involves convincing and mobilizing one's people for the shared goal. But of course, there are ways in which the system, as it is currently, falls short, and I want to talk more about that. It is a fair thing to ask. Why is it that Victoria 3 has interest groups, but not previous games? After all, the 19th century is all about industrial revolution, scientific progress, and economic growth. So what does any of this have to do with all these different interest groups? And why is this topic so exciting that I made such a long video about it? In order to explain that, I want to lay down a theoretical framework with which I want to approach this topic and the way the game deals with it. The interest group mechanic is not exciting merely because it provides an interesting internal politics engine that can keep you engaged within the confines of your country for most of the game. It is also the best lens for which we can view the story of the 19th century economic and technological development, which I believe is first and foremost a story of social change. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most of the world was in a state of a small yet powerful landed gentry having nearly a complete economic monopoly within their countries, while most of the population was forced to engage in economically unproductive agriculture. The world was poor, and most commodities were reserved for the very few rich. GDP growth was on average less than 1% and happened mostly due to population growth. This changed rapidly in the 19th century. Out of interest, I have looked up various ways that people try to explain the Industrial Revolution and the reasons why it has happened. Most of them usually vary between the very vague explanation of it happened because of capitalism, or just explain it by talking about technological innovation. But the real question here would be, what was present in the 18th to 19th century Britain that could have caused such a steep explosion in economic innovation? After all, technological innovation only barely picked up pace during the Industrial Revolution. While definitely important, new technologies such as the steam engine only kicked in right about the middle of the Industrial Revolution, since they required time, investment, and experimentation to be properly usable. At the same time, industrial technology was already quite advanced, as industry was much more economically productive than agriculture. From this here table we can see that the growth in industry was much greater than in agriculture already before the Industrial Revolution. Additionally, we can see that the more recent and revised estimates for total productivity growth before and after the Industrial Revolution, which are much more humble than previously thought. At its base, the Industrial Revolution was a manufacturing revolution, but not a technological one. So improvements in agriculture were very important, as these innovations increased the crop yield and decreased the workforce needed to work the fields. New laborers flooded the cities, and surely it is the existence of these new laborers that fueled the Industrial Revolution. However, Britain was not the only place where this was happening. In fact, there were plenty of countries that did not industrialize up until the eve of World War II, despite having a growing urban population. That is because the landed gentry mostly opposed to anything that resembled industrialization, either directly or indirectly. Both free market reforms and civil rights were not being expanded in these countries. As a result, the industrialization lagged greatly. Some countries in Eastern Europe saw 80% of their population still working in farms, while the rest were mostly working in an inefficient service sector up until the middle of 20th century. Which means that even when technology and urban population is available, industrialization is not a given. These aspects are not sufficient to explain such a stark change in economic growth. The Industrial Revolution is the cause of industrial innovation and economic growth, but it's not the result of it. The heart of it lies somewhere else. Usually when talking about economic and technological development, we rarely factor in the most important piece of anything that is economical, technological, or political: the human being. It is quite staggering how much of an afterthought we ourselves are when it comes to these questions. The academic propensity to abstract everything clouds our view of the economy so much that sometimes you can even see people arguing that population growth can be an impediment to economic development. Thanks to the Nobel Prize-winning economist Simon Kuznets, we can probably say that population growth is actually one of the main components of economic development. In other words, our population is the economy. But of course, it is never fully utilized, thus leading to a situation where some countries with large populations are poorer in absolute numbers than smaller but richer countries. This is why Kuznets also talked about other important factors in economics, such as knowledge, adaptation to change, and international change. In other words, he was describing that there are additional elements to the economy than just the population, but those elements are still mainly related to demographics. He wasn't wrong in pointing this out, but upon closer inspection, it's clear that some pieces are missing from the puzzle. After all, there are countries in the world that have well-educated populations and open trade, and still they struggle to compete with far less educated and smaller countries. The explanation must lie somewhere else. The economics of the time lacked any framework to explain this discrepancy, but it gave a start to the institutional economics. Combining political science and economic understanding, institutional economists try to pay closer attention to institutional change, both formal and informal, and social change in explaining such grand historical changes like the Industrial Revolution. And this is important to us because, after all, the first and second industrial revolutions are one of the main subjects of the game. And this is where demographic component was not only noticed but made a primary one. Daron Acemoglu and Dave Robinson famously showed that the countries with inclusive institutions, free market, democratic elections, the rule of law, fared better economically than those without them. But there was a degree of tautology in this explanation. All they could say is that inclusive institutions are inclusive and extractive institutions are not. Regardless, they do show that England achieved enormous economic successes largely due to their political and social institutions being relatively inclusive when compared to other countries. Now, some libertarians would jump here to say that the success of England was that the power of the king, aka the government, was limited, and thus the free market was established. And that would make sense at first sight, but then the power of the monarch in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was even more severely limited. The nobility, often seen as a single class, wielded so much power that the Polish king had to be elected and the country was referred to as a republic despite still being a monarchy in technical sense. The nobility took away the king's rights to create new taxes without the approval of the Sejm, or the parliament, while a 16-member elected council was appointed by the Senate to follow the king at all times with at least 4 advisors making sure that His Royal Majesty is doing nothing that goes to the contrary to the agreed Bill of Rights with the parliament. This also included levying a military force or declaring a war. If the king did not act as the nobility wanted him to, the nobles had a legal right to rebellion. Worst of all, any member of the nobility doing a Sejm had the liberum veto right to any law, which meant that legislating was a complete nightmare. The Polish-Lithuanian kings had varying degrees of power individually, but mostly compared to other monarchies in Europe, the monarch had relatively little say in the affairs of the country. And yet, despite the monarch's power being as limited as it was, there was no mass industrialization or even urbanization. The economy was weak and mostly rural, owned by nobles big and small. Their privileges and rights were never extended to anyone outside of nobility, as most cities were small and serfs had few legal rights regarding land ownership and free enterprise. Focused only on their own issues, the nobles neglected statecraft and only tried to enrich themselves. Instead of using courts to settle their disputes, the magnates even used their own serfs to intimidate and attack their opponents to advance their position within the country. The king could not employ the cities to support him against the nobility and thus could not protect them by granting them more rights when it comes to self-government and free enterprise. Poland-Lithuanian example shows us that the dominance of the Polish nobility was not equally distributed and not pluralistic. It did not invite competition and compromise, but rather discord and chaos. Because the government could not support complicated judicial institutions to resolve their conflicts, nobility did not peacefully resolve conflicts between themselves. Because of such zero-sum politics, it didn't create inclusive institutions to resolve disputes and defend their rights peacefully, which was what England had at the time. Inclusive institutions did not mean limited government as some may claim, but rather a representative government. So how does a state develop inclusive institutions? Darren Ajimolo and Dave Robinson only gave vague answers in that regard and thus did not provide us with an empirically provable theory on which methods we could use to both understand what happened in England and how to create such unique conditions. After all, inclusive institutions did exist before in other places like Song China. It started with the emperor realizing that having a large martial nobility was counter to the stability of the country. Therefore, the military nobility was let go and instead the bureaucracy took its place. This was possible, of course, because there were already nobles who did not depend on their martial might, and they welcomed the new changes as it meant they could participate in the government in a more profound way. And so the emperor began to rely on a bureaucracy that was not based on military prowess and daring, but on education and wit. And so, unlike previous bureaucracies, which were ripe with nepotism and corruption, the Song dynasty did their best to make sure that only the most qualified gained their bureaucratic posts, regardless of their origin. While this was limited in terms of how such bureaucracies function today, it was much more effective than anything else at the time. Access to bureaucratic posts were not doled out by military nobles, but were rather given out to those who performed the best in state exams, which were anonymous and fair. Needless to say, there was some nepotism. After all, the children of nobles had most access to education, but at the end of the day, if you happened to be a very educated peasant, you still had a chance to participate in the government. As a result, the Song emperors were not leaning on a powerful martial nobility and ruling like despots, and instead relying on a bureaucracy which had its own logic and power. Corruption was much lower than in previous dynasties, but the bureaucrats and ministers of the Song Empire still had some authoritarian central power tendencies. However, the nature of their work and education did not permit them to cross any legal and Confucian moral boundaries. And so the free market flourished. Since everything within the city limits was controlled by the central government, a growing merchant class settled outside the city walls. Since the rules barred the bureaucratic authority from micromanaging these towns, the protection of the state still applied. The Song commerce could operate as a free market. Over time, such outer towns grew in power and importance, while the coffers of the Song Empire dwindled. They had water-powered industries with mass production and mechanization, astronomical clock towers, movable type print, which allowed to spread literature and information, and even the first paper currency in the world. No such empire had previously created extensive naval trade routes and navigation technology which allowed the Song to travel and trade far and wide. It was the biggest economy in the world of that time. All of that 1,000 years ago. Which is to say, while the Song dynasty created conditions for a flourishing economy and breathtaking innovation, the world was a very different place. A lot of people in the world still lived pastoral and nomadic lifestyles. There was only a semblance of a global market, and the political upheaval that comes with being a large sedentary and continental polity was inevitable. The Song example is not a denial of the inclusive institutions theory, but rather it shows us that Britain was not in fact unique in history in having inclusive institutions, but rather simply unique at the time of Industrial Revolution. If that is the case, there has to be some sort of a common denominator that made Song China, England, and other such innovative countries able to achieve remarkable economic success. This is where Douglas C. North, John Joseph Wallace, and Barry Weingast comes in. Their book, they didn't respond to my emails. Violence and Social Orders expands upon the concepts developed by Ajimolo and Robinson in an important way. It finds an empirically based factor that explains how inclusive institutions both come to being and affect the quality of government. The book explains that almost all states start out as limited access natural states, or states where one interest group violently dominates over everyone else. As time goes by, the elite develops institutions that monopolize the violence and legitimizes its rule. This also leads to certain organizations that help support the various needs of the nobility. Over time, to avoid violence, the nobility starts employing law to resolve disputes. The more they depend on this law, the more such laws become binding to not just individuals, but also organizations, thus creating a new entity that is independent of a person. This is how the concept of impartiality slowly evolves. All of the elite benefits from impartiality and having courts that resolve their disputes fairly, as they never know which end of the stick they might end up on. Eventually, the right to access courts and create organizations becomes more and more accessible to the rest of the population, thus slowly turning natural states into open access states, which are accessible to a much wider population. This also opens up the nobility to exploit different economic routes than just agriculture. As Francis F. Fukuyama writes in Origins of the Political Order, urbanization took place in England not by accident. It was the result of the competition between the king and the nobility. Initially, the English monarch would dole up the land until death as a form of patronage, to gain the loyalty of his vassals. However, over time the nobles won the right to automatically inherit such lands, and the demands of the king started shrinking. As the king started losing his power to the nobles, he began supporting the rights of the cities in order to counterbalance the growing nobility. Thus, the nobility was not able to simply trounce the monarchy as they did in Poland and Lithuania. The competition between these two groups allowed a third one to thrive. This meant that over time England became a country of multiple competing groups of power, who resolved their conflicts in a peaceful way, and so allowing for a powerful and impartial judicial system that tried to fairly resolve such conflicts. Each new conflict ended in a compromise, and each new compromise expanded the civil rights afforded not just to nobility but to the rest of the population. Broadly speaking, of course. Women and children were rarely involved in such considerations. In terms of organizations, this meant that the initial organizations that supported the power of the elite had the same judicial status. Since judicial equality kept them being expanded and enforced, soon enough private individuals who were not necessarily members of the elite were able to charter these organizations too. This meant that England started having and respecting different organizations that were independent of the state or the elite, which meant that it became what is called an open access order. In most other countries, large swaths of the population were either trapped in a countryside, barely subsisting at all, or living in squalor in cities, where guilds dominated and work opportunities were very few. England, through the competition of its internal interest groups, slowly developed government institutions that allowed a much larger percentage of its population to engage in economic activity. And so the productivity of industries is irrelevant as long as people are able to establish companies and hire people. Industry will always be much more productive than agriculture. And as agriculture becomes more efficient over time and fewer people are needed plowing the fields, the cities will inevitably become crowded. The question whether or not these new urbanites will have the rights and the power to engage in the economy as equals is at the heart of this issue. The story of the Industrial Revolution is not necessarily a story of technology or capitalism, but first and foremost, it is a story of unleashing the incredible economic potential of any large part of the population that is no longer burdened by both agriculture and the elites who don't want them to become independent economic actors, which would undermine their rule, as a result of creative destruction which would follow any sort of technological or economic improvements. On the flip side, it also answers the question as to why industrialization does not happen as often, even though it is much more economically rational. In some places, the process of industrialization lagged and is still lagging precisely because the threatened elites do not want the empowerment of the masses. In some places, where the power of the elites is more consolidated, they are able to achieve this and prevent the majority of the population becoming equal factors in the economy, which would threaten their rents or profits that they gain because of a lack of a competition in the economic sphere. And this is precisely why the interest group dynamic is so important to understand the Industrial Revolution and the economic growth, and then, by extent, why it is so important that the game puts a large focus on interest groups. It is precisely these dynamics that gave the way to the tremendous changes to the world that happened in the 19th century and are still happening now, moving away from servitude and poverty into independence and plenitude. And now let's put everything into easy to use, reductive boxes that help us make sense of what we just went through. So if we really want to abstract everything into neat little boxes that work really well for video games, we can perhaps make a sort of theoretical framework from violence and social orders, which would put all of the societies in 3 neat boxes. The first one would be the primitive society. Now, I want to stress immediately that primitive here is not used as opposed to advanced. It's more like primitive as opposed to complex. Both primitive and complex are neither good nor bad things necessarily. For example, it is good to have a complex society that has structures which facilitate well-being and economic growth, but it's probably not a good thing to have a complex relationship with your family. In the same sense, primitive societies are smaller and thus do not require developing complex institutions. That doesn't mean, however, that people's lives in primitive societies are simple. They contain complex decisions and problems as any other societies. However, due to low population, the society itself is relatively simple. The economy in primitive societies could be described as simple, since there's no resource scarcity that would push the population into extreme optimization like we do now. There's no capital accumulation, there are few resources to go around, and they're mostly distributed equally. The economy functions based on trust and mutual dependence, much like a family does. Given that the population size is not that big, there's not much to organize. There are complex traditions and rituals for sure, especially in between the different groups, but within the group, there is no need for complex organizations. Eventually, external and internal pressure, such as better organized competitor groups and growing internal population pressure, demands more complex societal relationships. Initially, tribes probably oscillated between polities and anarchy, but as time went on, people had nowhere to move around anymore, and the population density started to growing. And so it became impossible to easily track social relationships and rely on trust. As a result, a dominating coalition slowly established itself over others and became the ruling elite, pushing everyone else down into the hierarchy. This became a limited access natural state. And it's characterized by resource scarcity, since the population density is so high that now there's fewer resources to go around, and the economy is controlled by rents, which are controlled by the elite. To maintain control, the elite had to restrict access to political and economic power to everyone else so that they may maintain control. In such states, complex organizations can hardly exist, and even when they do so in the latter stages and only to serve the needs of the elite. However, over time, the natural limited access orders can become mature limited access orders. And as elites become more and more organized and the societal and institutional structure more complex, that might open up new doorways for open access orders. External pressures, such as military competition, and internal pressures, such as better organized social groups within the country, might lead to expansion of access into the politics and the economy. And thus, an open access order is born, and it is characterized by resource scarcity leading to peaceful competition, rather than violent one, economic prosperity being available to the wider population, and all sorts of civil society organizations, which can exist peacefully since the government doesn't try to put them down but rather provides protection and juridical framework for peaceful competition. And this open access order is precisely what led to India, China becoming the world's manufacturing giants, and then finally England experiencing what we now call the Industrial Revolution. So when we are discussing the changes that happened in the timeline of Victoria 3, we are mainly talking about the switch from limited to open access. While primal communities do exist, they are currently unplayable. But perhaps their change to a limited access order could be discussed in the future as well. The switch from a limited access order to an open access order depends on there being different external and internal factors, which allow interest groups to compete with each other without destroying each other. All interest groups want to monopolize the economy, therefore only when they are equally powerful is it possible to get a non-monopolized economy. Therefore, it's the balance of power and the interplay between the interest groups that is central to this development. And that's why the interest group dynamic is so important to understand the Industrial Revolution and the economic growth that happened as a result of it. And that's why it's so good that the game puts such a strong focus on these interest groups. It's precisely these dynamics that gave way to the tremendous changes in the world that happened in the 19th century and are still happening now, moving away from servitude and poverty into independence and plenitude. Everybody knows that there is only 8 types of people in the world. Well, at least according to Victoria 3 that is, and they all support different interest groups. We start with none other than armed forces. These chads represent a military interest within the country. They tend to be conservative, but can go the other way too. Then we have the petite bourgeoisie, representing the majority culture, businessmen and women, always into repressing everyone, and fascism. The devout represent the followers of the main religion, a conservative interest group, but it does open up pathways towards education and healthcare, as long as they can be in charge of it. Industrialists, the new elite. They do rise up to topple landowners as the share of industrial sector grows, eventually dominating most of the countries with their free trade, low taxes ideology. Intelligentsia represent many things, but mostly they will be progressive and represent all that's good about the society, with a pinch of pretentiousness and know-it-allness. This slow and fat evil that is the landowners. Your first act boss that you must fight in the beginning. Landowners want the country to remain retrograde, inefficient and weak so they don't have a hard time staying in power. Easily pushed over. Right under them we have the rural folk, who represent the rural masses that are under the yoke of these retrograde landowners, although they tend to be no better when it comes to tolerating others. And then finally trade unions, who represent the urban masses, those that are under the yoke of the industrialists. Similar to rural folk, but tend to be less intolerant, will probably be the backbone of all of your progressive legislation in the endgame. While an 8-fingered glove sounds like it would be enough, the 8 interest groups nonetheless represent a very specific kind of society. A centralized Western society that has developed cities, is industrializing its economy, and has both national unity and central authority within the country. Simply put, they're open access countries which are a minority in the world even now. The multi-fingered hand that is our world would not neatly fit into this glove outside of those small little Western hands. There is a way Paradox tried to rectify this a little bit by adding unique interest groups to some countries, but in the end they still represent the same broad ideals as in the default countries. The problem is not the name or some specific piece of ideology, but rather that they do not form dynamically based on the problems and divisions within the country. For example, Russia has 11.3 million politically active peasant population, and we know good well how that would have ended. In reality, underserved and most Russian peasants were not concerned with politics and had little to do when it came to political activity. They weren't really allowed to even freely move between cities, so there's that. That is not to say that Russia didn't have any interest groups, of course, but they would not fit such a model very well. In Russia, you would have the Tsar as the most powerful political group that would not represent anything else but itself. A couple of factions of nobility, imperialistic jingoists and enlightened individuals who sought greater rights for the serfs. In such a despotic system, though, court intrigue plays a bigger role in politics than mass movements such as rural folk and trade unions, and that is something that the interest group mechanics is not able to accommodate. And that is to say that the monarchy in most countries would still be a powerful and separate political group that would compete with the aristocracy for power, with Britain being an important example. Otherwise, like in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the king might be weak and the aristocrats would then become the most politically active power brokers with their own groups and ideas. As it is now, when the aristocrats dominate, they just dominate. They're one singular group. There's no internal division or strife, and so the politics become boring. In an ideal world, one with unlimited computing power, an interest group would rise up organically from shared material and cultural interests, so that they would have multiple religions forming their own interest groups in countries where a lot of the politics are about religion. Same with ethnicity, racial groups, castes, and so on. Material politics forms only a small part of how politics work in most of the world, and that is not represented well in the game right now. This leaves a problem where, for example, there is no way an interest group could rise up to defend the rights of a discriminated group, for example, and then for the opposing interest group to rise up and defend the discrimination itself. Thus, we can't really simulate the civil war in the United States and the preceding Reconstruction period at all. For the game to reflect different political dynamics in different regions, there would be some changes that would be necessary. It would be interesting to see interest groups that could accommodate different political dynamics, such as cultural politics and royal court drama. It would be really fun to see that, and perhaps the developers could consider adding a more organic system in the future. And perhaps even let the player customize the interest groups a little bit according to their liking. And I do want to make a side note here regarding the organic creation of interest groups. Culture and politics sort of exist in parallel universes in this game. Discrimination is a binary stat that enables or disables the group's participation in politics, but doesn't really delve deeper into the intricacies of discrimination and political action any further. By focusing too much on materialism, the game ignores just how much culture affects our politics. In this scenario, the game enables unlikely alliances, such as a member of discriminated cultural group supporting an interest group that in turn supports the party that supports the discrimination of the said person. It is thus possible to have a Jewish shopkeeper support a fascist party in Europe despite the latter wishing to discriminate or even eliminate the former. A quick fix here is that only the primary culture can become petite bourgeoisie, and for example, in North Germany, only North Germans can become petite bourgeoisie, and South Germans for some reason can't own a business or become fascist, which is an arbitrary limitation. Additionally, it's not just petite bourgeoisie who can form the fascists, even though they're the most likely ones to. That's why I think more organic or custom interest groups would potentially help form more organic and believable political parties. Because right now the result is that most political parties do not form at all, interest groups change their support to political parties, and there's no stable party system. But that is perhaps a topic for another time, as is the topic of discrimination. Should you fire up the game as a small country and immediately start building industry and resource buildings, you might notice a peculiar thing. As more and more people freely leave their peasant hovels to participate in a grand industrialization project you have just concocted, the power of the landowners, rather unsurprisingly, plummets from around 55 to 60% to almost nothing in 5 years. And what do the landowners do about it? Well, first they do nothing. And then they repeat that. They barely seem to register that in a few years they went from being the big boss to hoping to get a waiting job at a restaurant belonging to some petite bourgeoisie fool. Once that happens, the player is free to change any laws as they please because the landowners effectively have no more say in it. Not being able to notice such changes isn't the only issue. Even if the landowners would notice that, they cannot ban peasants from leaving their fields, although serfdom is supposed to do that. They have no tools in their disposal to notice and affect the player's active actions. They can react in the de jure realm, but not the de facto. That is to say, while they do enable and react to different laws, they do not show any autonomous behavior when it comes to everything else that happens in the country. And thus, the change from your country being an aristocracy to an industrial oligarchy or even a democracy can happen rather quickly. No grand revolution is needed, simply drop down a couple of factories and watch the peasants drop their pitchforks and flee for the cities. The new power in town is the industrialists, and oh boy, they are here to stay. The landowners are, I suppose, just happy to be alive. That is because the elites have no agency to combat creative destruction. Economic innovation is good for the country but bad for the elites who depend on there not being any economic innovation. Most landowners normally do not need to worry though, since by nature limited access orders would not let outsiders take away their economic rent. But when factories and mom and pop shops start popping up all around the place, they should get worried. While interest groups do try to push the player towards enacting certain laws, they do not interact with each other, nor they react to changing economic or political realities. In this example, it would make sense that the landowners would try to counter industrialization and urbanization that threatens their base of power. However, they do not have any such tools at their disposal. It would be much more interesting to see the landowners actively work against the player's attempts to industrialize. The player would need to employ different interest groups and find ways to build coalitions between them in order to combat this. This would lead to a much more enjoyable gameplay experience, as industrializing would not be a matter of deciding which factory to build, but asking yourself, how can this be achieved by manipulating the interest groups? Or maybe you wouldn't want to go the British route. While the West was busy getting industrialized because it had complex civil societies that enabled participation in economy unhindered by the elites, the Soviet Union established a new elite that was perfectly fine with industrialization, just didn't want any new competition. It's not that there was any other way to go about it. Russia did not have the complex civil society that was needed for industrialization in the British example. So the new elite industrialized but maintained control over the state, and the state maintained control over the economy. Not to say that there wasn't any experimentation in free market reforms, such as the new economic policy, which was a great success in economic terms. However, this created a political problem for the communist elites, since the newly empowered agricultural entrepreneurs, known as kulaks, started demanding better prices for their goods, which made the Communist Party feel threatened, and therefore Stalin cancelled the project. After repressing the kulaks, collectivization was forced on everyone, and the state maintained absolute control over the economy. It would be interesting as well to see the game try to establish these different routes for the player to enact dictatorial and horrific top-down industrialization methods, since it shows why civil society is important. Economic growth without it can only be achieved through blood and violent methods. In this way, you do not need to create a pluralistic society that defends its rights and thus establishes a free market. You just need to make sure that the elite maintains control over the economy. Perhaps enacting a single-party dictatorship would be a precursor to such industrialization. The only way to industrialize without removing the elite is to make sure that the elite is the industry. That is because, as we discussed previously in the theoretical part, the nobility, the elites, the landowners, or the party elites will do anything to stay in power and maintain their privileges. There should be multiple venues to prosperity, but the nobility should be an actor rather than a proverbial wall that takes 10 years to tear it down. Systems stay the way they are for a reason, and it should be up to the player to devise their demise. To sum up, most of the countries, with a few notable examples, start out as essentially aristocratic oligarchies, dominated by few interest groups. The march from that to a pluralistic republic should not be a matter of plopping down a few factories and changing some laws in the ensuing hilarity. It should be a game where the player has to intelligently pit one group against another, just to find a venue for the third one to rise up and tip the scale in everyone's favor, or establish a totalitarian single-party rule. Up to you. Speaking of civil society, there is another issue that needs to be addressed with the current system. Plurality does not have a role in it. There cannot be a civil society that is dominated by a single interest group, because civil societies are essentially multiple competing and collaborating interest groups, from trade unions to industry advocacy think tanks. A good way to illustrate this by talking more about the differences between the various monarchies of 19th century Europe. Whereas the United Kingdom had all sorts of different interest groups within the country, such as merchants, industrialists, and later even labor unions as the working class started organizing. These different groups represented a counter-dominance coalition which curbed the power of monarchy, or any single group for that matter. And that is what made the parliament able to rule the country and represent most of the interest groups within the mainland United Kingdom fairly, while still remaining a monarchy. That was not the case in Russia at the exact same time. There were few interest groups that were able to counter the power of the emperor. There was no counter-dominance coalition. Since there was no political competition to the emperor, he remained mostly unrestrained by laws, constitutions, or parliaments. In Russia, since the reforms by Peter the Great, the newly established office of the emperor held absolute power. Not only did he dissolve the noble assembly by which his predecessors were elected, the administration was shifted from nobility to bureaucrats, which were appointed by the Tsar himself. He also tightened the grip of the monarchy on the church. The nobility, of course, tried to oppose his reforms, but unlike in England, they were too weak and too disorganized, and thus they were defeated and the office of the ever-powerful emperor prevailed. Both of these countries were technically monarchies, but the outcomes were very much different. The underlying power in Russia was held by the Tsar and his associates, while the English monarch had to constantly negotiate with a growing class of merchants, remaining barons, and economically prosperous artisans. As discussed in Violence and Social Order, more developed and democratic countries always have more diverse interest groups within them. The absolute number of registered organizations are much higher within countries that have a high income level. It is precisely the ability of the population to organize and reach peaceful compromises that gives us a functioning democracy. Otherwise, countries that are only ruled by one or two interest groups are normally our autocracies, oligarchies, and despotic monarchies, regardless of what their constitutions say. So the laws in Victoria 3 that deal with this are not entirely correct. The way you get there is a bit more murky. Let's say for some reason an enlightened Russian emperor decided to make his empire into a democracy. What do you think would really happen to a democracy when most of its population is illiterate and not active in politics? Well, what would happen is that it would simply not happen. A democracy is a political process in which different political groups are able to express their opinions and pursue their goals in a civil, non-violent way. These political groups must also cover most of the country. Altogether, they must represent the plurality of all interests within the country. A democracy that hinders or does not let a particular group of people, defined by race, caste, ethnic nationality, sexual orientation, and so on, whether officially by the word of law or by fact, is not a democracy. This is what some people mean when they say that the United States has only been a democracy for about 60 years. While theoretically Black Americans had the right to vote ever since they were emancipated, in reality this was not the case, as the government did not protect that right. In other words, while they were given this right in law, they were not protecting this right in fact, and thus it was not a real democracy in the real sense of the word. Meanwhile, an oligarchy is a political system where only a small group gets to govern the country, whether it's a republic or a monarchy. And lastly, an autocracy is a regime whereby the country is governed by a group of people that are all operating under a single ruler, be it a dictator or a monarch. This is not reflected very well in the game, however, as interest groups desire democracy or autocracy not based on their access to wield that power, but for their own benefit, but rather due to their inherent ideologies. That's why industrialists are more likely to demand oligarchy, but labor movements must remain neutral on the subject, even though in reality they would be just as likely to try and entrench themselves as autocrats or oligarchs. We all know historically that different configurations of both happened, so this seems more like a band-aid than an actual simulation. And perhaps that is where the game could do more to react to political configurations between separate interest groups, rather than just have it a law establishing, for example, oligarchy. We know well such laws do not exist in reality. It would be better if a democracy could only exist as long as there's at least, say, 3 strong interest groups that combined could represent the majority of the country, while if it's interest groups that only represent a minority of the country, or say just 2 interest groups, then that would only support an oligarchy, and while having just one would fall under autocracy. It would be interesting to see a simulation where a dominating interest group will try to entrench itself and thus create a problem for the player. If you want your country to be truly democratic, you cannot just let your favorite group let run things. It has to be a compromise between several groups. Otherwise, you are looking to create an oligarchy or an autocracy. Suddenly, the player has to play a new game of balance between interest groups, which can lead to both interesting challenges and new possibilities. In Victoria 3, interest groups have a significant blind spot. Unlike the foreign nations or the nobility and crusader kings, which can react to both the legislative and executive factions of the player, the interest groups can only see the law but not how it actually shapes the land. The previous example of nobles being perfectly fine with all of their peasants ditching the fields is one such example. Another example would be taxation. It is possible to have taxation effectiveness that is close to zero, which means taxes are not collected at all, and yet the industrialists will still want to have the tax law that will not affect their bottom line in any meaningful way. And as previously mentioned, the same goes for the government laws. A democracy is not a democracy if there is only one major interest group in power, and it's most certainly an autocracy if the leader in question has been elected democratically and just keeps winning elections every time. Anti-immigration sentiment doesn't make a lot of sense if there are no immigrants coming to the country, and I'm sure that the rural folk and the aristocracy have nothing to fear about granting broader rights to all citizens if only a few % of the citizenry is not part of the dominant group. So the interest groups are not able to track such nuances. They also don't track players' actions that might change their positions of power, or perhaps affect important questions to them. Should industrialists become more approving if the player chooses to build more factories? Aristocrats certainly should balk at it. However, building more plantations and farms would certainly benefit them. Unless the player decides to change the ownership, aren't the workers happier with the player now that they are running the factories? These are the questions that currently the game is not able to answer, and I do believe that executive actions should be weighed by the interest groups to be either favorable to them or unfavorable to them. It would be interesting to see a powerful interest group blocking players' actions if they do not fit their agenda, or demanding player to do something in exchange for it, which is really how politics works. You usually compromise and reach deals, and that's how you move forward. Foreign policy also comes into play. Why are the right-wing radicals fine with the player forming protectorates, customs unions, and trade unions? After all, these things make our national economy dependent on filthy, potentially hostile, and often very much different foreigners. Also invite them to our lands. Why are the deranged petite bourgeoisie silent on such issues of zero rational importance? Wouldn't it be interesting to see interest groups actually track their power level in the country and react to certain executive actions by the player? This way, they are able to quickly react to dangerous actions undertaken by the player, start revolting even if the industrialization goes out of hand, or the player starts demolishing farms. Maybe sometimes the player's actions would be blocked and he would need to make a deal to move forward with the plan. This would make reconstructing and developing the nation a much more interesting and nuanced process. Victoria 3 also employs the concept of institutions. The player might pass laws that establish different institutions, such as the police, healthcare system, and so on. Once the institutions are established, the player may spend their hard-earned bureaucracy points to expand those institutions. By doing so, the effect of the institution compounds and becomes more noticeable at the cost of said bureaucracy points. So how do interest groups and institutions interact with each other? Well, they simply do not, at least not yet. The only way there is any interaction between these two concepts is that sometimes interest groups ask for laws that would establish those institutions, but it doesn't go any further than that. There is a hint towards some sort of relation, and it lies within budget spending. If the player is more keen on spending more for bureaucrat salaries, the intelligentsia and petite bourgeoisie will like them more, probably because they are more likely to work in those jobs. Same goes for the salaries for the military men. The armed forces will appreciate you more if you line their pockets. Having said that, it does seem more like another band-aid rather than a design solution. Why these specific interest groups and not any others? Is it inconceivable that an aristocrat or industrialist would be working within the bureaucracy? Wouldn't different interest groups want to have more control over what happens in those different institutions? These questions are not answered by the game right now, but I think there's a huge opportunity here. In real life, institutions do not exist outside the realm of reality. As anything else within any given country, they can perform their duties with absolute rationality and fairness, or they can be captured by an interest group. In academic literature, it is normally called institutional or regulatory capture. It is a process whereby an interest group covertly takes control of an institution and then diverts it from serving the common good towards serving more narrow interests. There are plenty of examples of this happening within different countries, such as the FCC in the United States. According to Peter Schuck of Yale Law School, the FCC is subject to capture by the media industry's leaders and therefore reinforce the operation of corporate cartels in the form of corporate socialism that serves to regressively tax consumers and impoverish small firms, inhibit new entry, stifle innovation, and diminish consumer choice. More recently, the conservative hold over the Supreme Court could also be considered an act of institutional capture, as the institution tends to act more in the ways that the Republican Party would want to act them, rather than serving the law in a non-partisan and neutral way. Within the game there is some kind of a hint already about certain bureaucratic forms favoring one interest group over the other, even if the spending effect stays the same. However, it is hardly sufficient to properly simulate how interest groups would behave historically. If the broad strokes of the idea are already in the game, why not expand upon it? This would not just make interest groups more active in internal politics, but will also open up a way for simulating corruption. Instead of having corruption to be some sort of a modifier for general lack of state capacity, it could happen more similar to how it would happen in real life. A direct capture of public institutions by private interests. Institutions that are captured could provide clout to their interest group and less public goods to the rest of the country. As a result, to promote certain groups, the player might have to encourage others to engage in institutional capture, at the cost of the country's administrative capacity and increased corruption. Which means that the player might need to clean up the corruption they themselves have allowed to fester, leading to some interesting dynamics throughout the game. Thus, it would be up to the player to clean up such privately captured institutions, to reduce the state corruption within the state apparatus, and it would give the interest groups a map or a chessboard to fight over. It would also force the player to carefully consider if they want to let only one interest group run the show. After all, if they take over all the institutions, the country might become more corrupt, less efficient, and prey to more effective industrialized countries. We've seen it so many times. The communist emperor of Great Britain looms large within the game. The revolution strikes those who least suspect it, and thus the giant tower of democracies erected within the country, granting us equal rights, the vote, and all the obligatory cash that comes with it. There are though some problems with it. Have you noticed that rarely do these communist revolutions do what they did in real life? That is, take over all the government institutions and enact a dictatorship of the proletariat, or something similar. They really seem to be keen on remaining democratic, even though all the power is within their hands. Now, of course, the game has a band-aid for it. Some communists become vanguardists, more revolutionary advanced sections of the working class, which should temporarily take over power until everyone else can become as advanced as they are, and the dictatorship can be dismantled. Of course, that rarely happens in reality. In fact, that has never happened, and the same is true for the game. However, should these vanguardists in fact take over power and become the ruling class of the country, they do not bar anyone else from running the thing. It is not impossible to have the petite bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia running the country afterwards, since the game has no mechanics for one interest group to bar others from running the show. The same is true for any other group. At any given point in time, the player can, against their own better judgment, kick anyone out of the government and add someone else, so long as they at least have 5% clout. What is also a bit counterintuitive is that a lot of revolutions that are democratic in nature do not entrench themselves and thus give universal suffrage free rein, effectively putting themselves out of the power as soon as the losing interest groups inevitably regain their clout. Of course, real life teaches us that even the most democratically thinking groups try to find ways to entrench themselves. It is not to say that it is impossible to have a democratic revolution, but such revolutions are usually pluralistic, as in, they should include parts from different sections within the country, aka different interest groups, which can act as a counterbalance to each other when dividing power. As such, revolutions containing more interest groups could be more democratically inclined, while those that include just two could be oligarchic, or simply end up being authoritarian. This would make the game a bit more high stakes when it comes to distributing the power in the government, forcing the player to ensure that there are counterbalances for each group, or otherwise even the underdogs might demand the exclusion of those who previously were the masters. Another interesting mechanic in this regard would be that if you have a democracy that is constantly represented by a government that is not actually representative of either the majority of the population or the plurality of it, you might start seeing a slide towards more oligarchic and restrictive forms of government. That is, even if interest groups would normally support democracy, seeing their ability to hold on to power deteriorate, they would then do what they can to stay relevant by reducing the voting base, moving towards the oligarchy, or both to stay in power. Oligarchy could be made up of governments that only represent numeric minority of a population, but democracy would require consistent representation of a large portion of the population that is at least close to half of all politically active people to be considered anything resembling a real democracy. This would have removed the unrealistic lead of democratic countries by very narrow interest groups, at least in theory. It could also reduce the favoritism that any player might experience. You might like the progressive ones, but if you give them too much power, they might like it too much and just entrench themselves. And you don't want anybody to be entrenched because it would not be economically viable and it would turn your country into a disastrous dictatorship where somebody's rights are going to be trampled. But politics shouldn't be all doom and gloom, power grabs and betrayals. It could also be warm alliances and compromise. In order to achieve their goals on making their voices heard, or even to dominate the politics of the country, various interest groups could also make alliances with each other. While they are not technically a uniform group, they are represented by a specific people, who can in turn look for alliances. For example, an interest group might help pass a law that another interest group wants in exchange for a political favor, which could then be spent on something similar in the future. In this case, the landowners could give the rural folk closed borders if they help with blocking a construction of a factory in the city. After all, ideally both building factories and passing laws are actions of political nature, so it stands that interest groups should have some sort of a say in it. The innovation here being that the interest groups could coordinate such actions tit for tat and build towards something big in the future. Interest groups shouldn't just compete and exclude, but should also cooperate and co-opt each other. Long-term cooperation could then finally result in these groups starting parties together. This would create a more stable party system and would make sense in the long term, rather than having it as it is now where just a couple of interest groups run around willy-nilly from one political party to the next. Thus, the ultimate game of politics would take place inside the country, where different groups would learn how to work with each other for a common goal, or at least a goal that the other one doesn't hate. This might lead to unexpected alliances and even stranger bedfellows, but allowing interest groups to play the game of politics opens up the change for a truly democratic system where the governance is decided with the consent of those that represent the people more broadly rather than narrowly. Diplomatic plays and alliances could be a feature of internal politics and not just external politics in Victoria 3. We live in a world where history never really ended, and a careful balance that is democracy seems to be toppled in one country after another. Democracy is a complicated process that requires people to be able and willing to involve themselves in politics, and to represent themselves through different interest groups, be they renters' alliances, labor unions, or the local book club. The game here presents a great basis for such processes to be explored in much more depth than previously attempted. It would be interesting if, with institutional capture and barring other interest groups from political participation and fighting over which factory or plantation should be built, processes that happened all over history, the interest groups would not just become variables that represent likelihood to pass one law or another, but actually would become both potential allies and enemies of the player, requiring constant management and realignment not to stray too far from one another. At the moment, it is all too comfortable for a player like me to have a trade union and intelligentsia-ruled utopia that is unchallenged internally and brings everyone together in unison. Real life is rarely like that, unfortunately. Things like ambition, fear, demagoguery will always split people apart and make them fight against each other instead of building such beautiful utopias. Building well-functioning societies requires you to create a well-functioning balance, and Victoria 3 stands a lot to gain from trying to simulate that. With some improvements, the interest group mechanic could actually be able to replicate such complicated processes. Doesn't have to though. The game is great as it is, and it represents the single most in-depth internal political simulation by simply treating people as objects of politics rather than abstract concepts. But I do feel that by going deeper than that, the game could become much better. Thank you for listening. Let me know if you like this type of content and if you want to see more of it. Also, any critiques or questions are welcome. I could do a follow-up where I could answer them, since I tackled quite a few complicated topics here and I might be wrong, or maybe something needs clarification. So please do feel welcome to comment below.